Edwards, was just coming from Norway, so he's still in the European time zone right now. You arrived yesterday, something like this, no?
Yeah, a couple days ago.
Yeah.
I'm still getting to bed very early.
So Damian is the program manager of. He's a program manager on the ASP.NET team. He owns web forms. So if you have complaints about web forms, that's him. And if you if you likes if you like web form, that's him too. Okay. He was also, and he's still, I think, he's the a PM on SignalR. And if you have questions about SignalR, that's him too. He knows everything. And recently he's been working a lot on new web, well, always on new web technologies, AngularJS with ASP.NET, the new stuff for the future of ASP.NET, very interesting stuff, the thing you will use in the next 10 years. And so thank you, Damien, for being here.
Thanks, Sebastian. Okay, I trust you can all hear me. I can't hear myself through the speakers, so tell me if I'm quiet. So yeah, recently I've been looking at some different stuff. Yes, I do own web forms, but I don't do a lot of that these days, Sebastian, so you don't have to keep saying it. You know, it's fine. You can introduce me as the guy who invented SignalR and da-da-da-da-da, but yeah, just leave the web forms out for the moment. But in all seriousness, no, there's a few of us on the ASP.NET team. I've been focusing a lot on sort of the next generation, the next 10 years of what web development will look like on our platform. Now, of course, that's kind of ridiculous because we have no idea what things will look like in 12 months, let alone 10 years. But at the moment, a lot of that centers around reimagining and rethinking about what web development looks like on our platform. And a lot of that involves the client. If you look at what happened in the late 90s when we first started developing ASP.NET, obviously you'll know that it was vastly server-based. And for the next 10 years after that, most of the logic and most of the framework that we shipped was revolved around doing stuff on the server. That's changing. Moving forward, you'll see a bigger focus on solving the problem of how we do development on the client. That is in the browser, whether you want to call them single-page applications, spas, just Ajax, which really it is what it is, or whatever it is, then you're going to see a bigger focus on that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff I've been looking at today. This is only a 45-minute session, so it's not an in-depth in Angular. I'm not going to be able to spend 45 minutes talking about Angular, so if you hadn't seen Angular before, you'll pick it up as I go along. This is going to be exploring more about what does it mean to use these technologies in an ASP.NET application, and what are we looking at doing to make that more productive and more enjoyable to use. So the future of single-page applications in ASP.NET. To date, what we've had is a lot of people ask us, what should I be using when I'm going to be doing spas? Now, we've shipped a spa template previously, which wasn't particularly great. The approach we're taking moving forward is that we're going to focus on what we're calling a blessed stack. That is a group of technologies that we will take if you want a bet on the front end. Now, the reason we're doing that is because in order to give you the best development experience, the kind of tooling experience you're used to in Visual Studio, rich IntelliSense, debugging, templates, snippets, et cetera, we kind of have to choose something. If we don't choose something, then you'll get a mediocre experience for everything. Obviously, the thing that we do choose, we want to be popular. We want it to kind of be self-evident as to why we're choosing it. And to that extent, we've chosen Angular at this point. Angular is by far the most popular and most sort of meteoric rising client framework at the moment. It is much more than a client library. It really is an application framework, and it focuses on doing a certain set of things and does them very well. It also has a fantastic trajectory towards converging with emerging web standards. So I hear you had a talk on Polymer and web components yesterday, which of course is an evolving web standard. The trajectory of AngularJS is one that intersects with Polymer and web components. In fact, Angular 2.0 is going to remove a lot of the proprietary stuff in Angular and switch over to using these standards-based things like web components and new standards-based, what are they, observables and promises. And then they'll polyfill the gaps in browser support using things like Polymer. So to that, we're very happy looking at Angular. The other thing is our own community, ASP.NET, a lot of our thought leaders are already doing Angular. They're already teaching Angular. They're using Angular with their customers. And so it seems to be the right choice for us right now. jQuery is still a big part of this stack. Angular includes sort of a lightweight jQuery abstraction or API set. And full jQuery is still very useful when you have to do very DOM-heavy things. Bootstrap. We've already been shipping Bootstrap in our templates for a while. There are other CSS-based frameworks. So those who don't know what Bootstrap is, it's a layout framework for CSS. It includes sort of layout primitives, a grid system, some standard classes for denoting success and errors and form layout and those type of things. And it also includes a bunch of very basic widgets that you might need to build sort of a standard UI that might be form-based. And there's a lot of good theming sites available for Bootstrap and those type of things. And we're looking at improving tooling around that as well. Less than Sass, CSS is great, but CSS sucks. So we want to do something a little bit better. And Less and Sass have kind of emerged as the forerunners in those. I don't really have an opinion on which you use. Use what makes you happy. I've been using Less in my sort of experiments. But if you want to use Sass, knock yourself out. We'll have tooling and support for both. Typescript is something I'm very interested in. Who's been using Typescript? Okay, a couple of hands. So TypeScript has actually gotten a lot more traction outside of the Microsoft community than inside the Microsoft community, which is kind of interesting. Totally optional. If you don't want to use TypeScript, obviously you'll use JavaScript. We'll have first-class support for JavaScript, and we're going to continue investing heavily in supporting JavaScript in both our tooling and templates and whatnot. But TypeScript offers solutions to a bunch of problems that come along with building quote-unquote large-scale JavaScript applications. And in the experiments I'm going to show you today, I've been using TypeScript, and I've been looking at how I can leverage some of the features of TypeScript to get rid of some of that boilerplate in things like Angular. How can I, if I was to take the intersection of TypeScript functionality and some of the things that Angular does and overlap them, what can I remove? What can I make simpler by doing that? And I'll show you an example of something we've put together that we think is kind of compelling there. And then lastly, on the tooling side, we have Grunt and Bauer. Now, Grunt could be gulp, and I'm using strange words if people have never used it, heard of these things before. Who's heard of Grunt? Okay, so a bunch of you haven't. So Grunt is a task runner. You can think of it as kind of like MS Build, but not really. It's based on Node, so it's cross-platform by default, which is kind of cool. Grunt actually won the Netty Open Source Project of the Year that just gone past. So Grunt has a lot of groundswell. There's an alternate framework called Gulp. So we have Grunt and we have Gulp. And they kind of do the same thing, but they go about them a different way. Essentially, they're ways for you to run tasks during development. So combining JavaScript files, compressing them, compressing images, transpiling CoffeeScript to JavaScript, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it has a rich community of plugins that let you perform these tasks that you can sort of compose into a build script and then run while you're developing. Bauer is a client-side package manager. So we all know what NuGet is. NuGet is the package manager for .NET. Bauer is a package manager for things that are loaded by the browser, essentially, okay? For JavaScript, CSS, images, those type of things. And it only deals with that type of content. So it's very, very good at it. NuGet pretty much is terrible for dealing with content. We have content packages in NuGet. We have jQuery and things like that. But it's never really been good at doing content. It has a lot of drawbacks that, frankly, are probably not going to be fixed because of the way NuGet works. It's really designed around doing assemblies for .NET and native. So Bauer is a fantastic client-side package manager, and it's used by all client packages. If you go to any standard or emerging JavaScript libraries webpage and it says, how do you get this JavaScript library? Generally, the first thing it says is Bauer install this. It's kind of become the de facto standard for this stuff. So here's our stack. And then obviously there's a whole server-side stack. You would have seen the news about ASP.NET vNext. I'm not going to be talking about that today. I'm going to be focusing very much on this client-side stuff. So a very quick introduction to Angular. Who has used Angular? Okay, good. So you have a fairly, half the room has a little bit of idea what I'm talking about. So these are the 5 main things that you need to worry about in Angular. As I said, this is not a 45-minute talk in Angular, so I'm going to gloss over these, and then as I go through, you'll see where these come in. So we have controllers, views, services, directives, and filters. Controllers is a really bad name because it kind of conflicts with every other MVC or whatever type framework on the planet. I like to think of the controllers in Angular more like a view model. So if you've used an MVVM type pattern in stateful client programming, in XAML, Silverlight, WPF, those type of things, then the controller in Angular is much more akin to a view model. If you've used Knockout, then it's very similar to that, but a lot more powerful. Views, obviously, are the HTML. They're the things that get rendered. They have templating. They have data binding. It's all that goodness that goes into the view. It's where you actually compose your UI. Okay? Services are the things that you use in your application. Again, we're talking about the front end here. We're talking about everything in JavaScript. Services are the things that aren't in controllers. They're the things that you reuse across controllers. They might be functions that you use to call out to web services. They may be business logic that you want in the client side. But essentially, they're the things that aren't controllers. They're business logic or the ability to access stuff on the server. Directives is where a large part of Angular's power comes from. This is what's going to be replaced by web components in 2.0. This is the part of Angular that lets you extend the HTML syntax and basically invent your own elements or your own attributes. So you can write a directive that when a particular attribute is seen on an HTML element, some logic takes place. Okay? Directives are all about interacting with the DOM. They're all about manipulating the HTML. Whereas controllers, you should never be touching the HTML. Same goes for services. This is all about separation of concerns between these different building blocks. And then lastly, filters. Filters are very simple functions that take an input, do some processing, and return an output. And you generally use them when composing data binding in views. So if you've ever used any type of data binding system, you'll know what a data binding expression is. It basically says, put this data here in the view. A filter just lets you run that data through a function before it goes into the view. Okay, very simple. Okay, so the app we're going to be looking at is a port of the music store, the MVC music store, turned into a SPA. Now, the source for this is up on the new ASP.NET GitHub repository, github.com, whack ASP.NET, whack music store. If I just go up there. So here it is here. I'm in the dev branch, and I'm under the source folder in a folder called mvcmusicstore.spa. So this is the application I'm going to be showing you for the next half hour. So if you want to follow along or want to look at it later, this is where you need to go. Okay. So as I said, this has been a bit of an experiment to see what would it look like when we incorporate this new blessed stack into an MVC, a typical MVC application, and then convert it into a SPA. What are the opportunities we have to kind of make MVC, the server side, and the new client-side technologies work really well together? So let's have a look at the application structure. That's enough of the slides. I'm going to spend most of my time in Visual Studio now. So I have the project up here. I've opened it straight from GitHub. And you'll note that the solution actually has 4 projects in it. I'm only going to focus on the last one. The first 2 are versions of this application running on ASP.NET vNext. Okay, so we're not going to look at those today. MVC Music Store is the original MVC Music Store. And then MVCmusicstore.spa is my SPA conversion. That's the one we're going to look at today. So let's have a look at the application structure. Pretty standard sort of MVC stuff. I have a controllers folder. I have an APIs folder which contains some API controllers. We'll look at those in a minute. I have some models, I have some view models, and I have some views. That's all server-side. Okay? Everything we've looked at so far is pretty typical for an ASP.NET sort of server-side application. I have an apt start, which has some config stuff in there, which we're not too interested in. And then I have this folder called client. So one of the things we're very interested in is what's the best way to lay out these projects when we have a big chunk of server-side logic, but then a big chunk of client-side logic. One of the things we're trying to do is kind of break people out of this idea that the client side of my application is small. I have a few bits of script. I may have a little bit of CSS, but ultimately that's just there to support most of the action which is going on in the server. That's not the case when you're building a SPA. There's really a balance here. I have a bunch of logic on the server. I have my models being defined there, a bunch of business logic, data access, web APIs, et cetera, and some server-side rendering, which we'll look at. But a very large portion of my app, maybe even the majority of my app, is in the client. All the UI composition takes place in the client, not in the server anymore. And so we need to have a folder layout and an app structure that really reinforces that. So I have a folder called client, which you can imagine contains all the source code for my client. I'm going to open this up. We'll have a look at what I've done here. Now, again, this is all just experiments and opinion. You can do whatever you like, but this is something that I found works particularly well as I went through and built this application. So I have a less file. Here's my CSS for this application, site.less. I have a fav icon, and I have some images. Okay, pretty standard static stuff other than the less so far. Then I have a folder called ng apps. Now, I've called it ng app. Now, ng is an abbreviation for Angular. You'll see it throughout the Angular documentation, the Angular source code. ng just means Angular. Okay, so ng apps. Underneath here, I have 2 folders, musicstore.admin and musicstore.store. They represent the two discrete Angular applications I have in this larger ASP.NET application. So now we're into the idea of what I call sparlets, or mini spars. It's not really about one page for my entire application. It's about islands of spar functionality that sort of map to the logical areas of functionality for my app. Now, in the case of the music store, which is a very simple application, there's really two distinct applications. There's the one that customers use, and then there's the one that admins use. Okay? So I have two Angular applications, my store, which is the front end, and my admin, which is the back end. The admin has a lot more forms and CRUD and that type of stuff. The store is more browsing and searching and those type of things. Then we have common components, which is in this components folder. And you can see I have quite a lot of those. Each one of these folders represents one of those building blocks or an implementation of one of those building blocks from Angular. So I have some directives in here, I have some services, and I have some filters. I don't have any controllers in here because controllers go with views, and views go in apps, and they're generally not reused. They're usually part of an application, such as my store or my admin. So this folder mainly contains filters, services, and directives. And we'll drill into a few of these in a moment. If I look at my store, I've then broken down the store into two functional areas. Now, there's a whole bunch of schools of thought around how you should organize your source files for an Angular application. Should you have a folder called controllers and a folder called services and put all the like-minded JavaScript files in there? In my case, I've chosen the functional layout. So I say, well, this is a functional area of my application. I have catalog and I have home. There's sort of two views in my application. And I'm going to organize my files that way. I find that this is better for growth over the long term. Having a controllers folder and a services folder and a directives folder, as your application gets larger and larger, it's going to become more difficult to open the controllers folder and then find the actual controller you want out of the dozens and dozens and dozens that you have as your application gets bigger. The official Angular documentation has now moved to this model as well, which is use functional areas for the organization of your source code. A lot of you may do a similar thing for your server-side code. You might start out with a controllers folder and have all your controllers, and then you might, over time, move into having more functional layout for your server-side assets as well. If I flip into home, I have two files. I have a view here, home.html, and I have a controller, home.controller. Okay, now in this case, I'm using Typescript, and I'll talk a little bit more later about how I'm using Typescript in here. But if we open up one of these, let's open up my home controller. This is an example of a controller. So as I said, I treat controllers very much like view models. So my home controller implements an iHome view model, which is defined just up here in the same file. I have a constructor for my home controller, which takes in dependencies. One of the sort of underpinnings of Angular is this idea of dependency injection. Now, I believe most people in here will be familiar with the dependency injection. Angular really embraces dependency injection to the point that you really can't use it without using dependency injection. It's one of the core facets of how it works. And so when I create my controller, anything that I want to use from my controller, I take in as an instance as a constructor parameter. Okay? Now, if I wasn't using TypeScript, if I was just using plain JavaScript, I would be registering this controller by way of just a standard function, a JavaScript function, and the parameters of that function would be my dependencies. So I have a constructor function here because it's TypeScript. In JavaScript, it would just be a plain function that I would be passing into an Angular primitive. And then you can see very simply, the constructor happens. I take in my album API, which is this iAlbum API service, which is, again, this is all TypeScript. This is all client-side. And then I'm going to call a method, which represents some data from the server. And then when that's finished, I'm going to take that result and I'm going to shove it onto my view model, which in turn will be rendered by my view. So if I have a look at my view, here it is. Let's full screen that. It's just HTML. There's nothing particularly fascinating here. It's a snippet of HTML. I have this ng controller attribute here, which is how I tell Angular where the source code is for this view. Like, where am I going to get data from? Where's the logic? This is the syntax you use for telling the name of the controller as it's registered in Angular's DI system. And the as view model is one of two ways of using controllers in Angular. Now, again, I don't have the time to drill into everything, but this as syntax was introduced in a later version of Angular and seems to be getting a lot of a love as an alternate way of using Angular. If you've used Angular before, you may be familiar with $scope, the scope being the thing that kind of glues the view to the controller together. The as is an alternate way of binding your view model to your controller to your view without using scope directly, okay? That's all I'm going to say on that. In this application, all I use is this as model. So this is the full name of my controller. If we go back to here, you'll see why. musicstore.store.home is the module, and home controller is the name. musicstore.store.home.home controller. And inside this element here, I want it to be known as view model, okay? Here's an example of a data binding expression, album.title. That's album.title because I'm using ng repeat here. So this is a for each. This is an example of an Angular directive. Remember, directives are the things that let me extend the language of HTML. And so in this case, there are a whole bunch of built-in directives in Angular. They start with ng dash. So it's going to say for every album in viewModel.albums, for each, go ahead and render out this snippet of HTML wrapped in this snippet of HTML. So these are data binding expressions. This is the handlebar syntax or the mustache syntax you may have seen in other data binding frameworks. Angular uses a very similar approach. Okay, so that's a very quick introduction to the app folder layout and a very quick introduction to the most basic of controllers and views. I actually have it running here, so let's have a quick look through this. Here's the home page of the music store as a SPA. If I hit F5, you can see it loads up as the music store always does. I have a menu up here so I can drill in and look at Latin. Don't have a lot of cover art, I'm sorry. And I can click through. And you can see that this is a SPA. Like, it's not going back to the server when I click through these things. More so, the back button still works because any decent SPA framework will make sure things like the back button work. I can go all the way back to the front. I can click on things from the beginning, and it's what you'd expect. It's a basic sort of music store application where I can click around and do things. But this time it's happening all through a SPA. It's not going back to the server for each click. Cool. Okay, so let's talk about server-side rendering. One of the first things people ask when they think about using a SPA framework with MVC or ASP.NET in general is that ASP.NET has been server-side rendering predominantly since day one, right? And still is today. So does that mean when I go the SPA approach that all the server is doing now is serving JSON as a result of web APIs? Well, yes, you can do that. But we have this powerful server-side rendering framework in ASP.NET. In MVC, we have this wonderful language called Razor. And we're looking to make some really, I think, fantastic improvements to that in vNext, by the way, just to give you a heads up. So what can we do in a SPA application to enhance the application as a whole by leveraging server-side rendering where it makes sense? Okay, so let's have a look at some of the things that we've done in this application that I think are kind of interesting. So let's have a look at the admin page, because this has more forms. Okay, let me just go back and actually show you that so you can see what I'm talking about. I'm already logged in as administrator, so I'm going to flip through to the admin site. So here's a grid view, essentially, of the albums. I can page through these. Last, first, a nice pager experience down there. I can hit details, and I get the details for this particular album. I can hit edit, and I get an edit form for this type of thing. If I hit delete, I get a nice modal that comes up. I hit delete, it takes me back to the list with an album deleted successfully. So there's a lot of functionality going on here. I mean, it's pretty standard stuff, but if you were to build this from scratch today in MVC, that's quite a lot of work to do even this type of basic UI. This is the type of thing that we took for granted in web forms. You drag a grid view on, you do a bunch of stuff. Hey, you've got a CRUD application that's really simple. But building like a decent grid in MVC is particularly difficult. This one even has things like sorting, and you can see there's actually a little glyph here. So when I sort, it actually tells me which way it's sorting. That comes straight from Bootstrap. And the sort is preserved across page navigations. It actually works the way you would expect a grid to work. And I can delete directly from here as well, by the way. So that modal now, same modal, but instead of coming up on the edit form, it's now coming up over the grid. I can hit delete, and it removes it and takes me back to the beginning of the data set. Okay? It's fairly functional. Obviously, I can create a new one as well, which is a very similar form to what you saw before. If I hit save, save's actually disabled because the form is invalid at the moment. If I try and put something in here and delete it, you can see I get real-time validation, all the stuff I would expect from this type of form experience. So how did we do that? So obviously, I could just use all the Angular primitives for doing forms. Angular has a rich set of functionality for dealing with specifically this type of stuff, doing forms. It's really what it's great at. But Razor has this concept of helpers. Why should I have to manually write out all this crap every time I do a form when I have helpers? So to that end, I wrote a set of helpers specifically for Angular. Okay? Text box, drop-down list, those type of things to make this stuff simple. I'm not going to show you the source code. Let's have a look at what it actually looks like to use. So let's go into admin, and I'll have a look at the edit view. Note that this is a CS.html file, not an HTML file, because I'm going to use helpers. Okay? So here I'm using server-side rendering to produce the template that Angular is then going to use to render views. Okay? So I've got this sort of two things going on. This is only rendered once by the server. It's turned into HTML once, and then Angular uses that HTML over and over again to render those edit forms depending on which album I look at. How did I do that before I look at that? Well, I have a special controller in here called the template controller. Here it is. Which all it knows how to do is to find CS HTML files from that path. And if you basically you ask for the template from the template controller, you give it the path. It has to be relative to this root in my application, and then it will return that as a view. That happens once per application. Angular is only ever going to get the view once, and then it caches it. Okay. So I'm using Razor to render the templates that Angular is going to use. Now I can use Razor helpers. So you can see I have a mixture of Angular directives in here, ng controller, I have some data binding, but I also have Razor going on. I've got a model up here, which is my album. Now, Razor is never going to render an instance of an album in this view, right? Because it's only ever going to get requested as a template. But when it comes down to things like using helpers, I need to have that model. I need to know what type am I rendering template for. So what have we got? This is an example of a form field right here. So this is laid out using Bootstrap. That's how I got that nice form layout there. This is essentially the minimum, well not the minimum, but the optimal set of HTML that you need to render that style of form using Bootstrap with the Angular validation. So I've got an outer div called with a class of form group, that's from Bootstrap. Then I've got the ng class directive, that's an Angular directive built in, which says render the class as whatever the result of this Angular expression in. Now I have a helper to do that. So I have a helper called ng validation class 4. I pass in the property, artist ID, the name of the form, which is, if you go up here to the form, you can see that the form has a name of edit album. And then the class name has error. Okay? What error do I want to render as when there is a validation error? That's around the entire form field. That's why the entire form field goes red, so including the outline and the label, okay? Because the whole thing is marked as an error. Next off, I have the actual text, label 4. That's a standard helper. I didn't write a new one. That's the standard Razor label 4 helper. Next, I have the structure that contains the actual field. Class col md10. That is Bootstrap saying 10 columns of layout on the right-hand side to contain the form field. Then I have a row. Again, Bootstrap, create a new row. Inside that row, I have a separate column, which is 6. So remember, Bootstrap is a 12-column-based system. So that's effectively like saying 50%, okay? Except it's grid-based, so I say 6 columns out of 12. Then I have the drop-down list helper. So this is a new helper. We all know the drop-down list helper in MVC sucks. The one in there is horrible. I don't know how anyone uses it. So I wrote one that works. This one works with Angular. So it all data binds client-side. You can either go out and get the data from the server, or you can render the data in line, and it can do it that way. It also deals with just rendering the value for the current record now, and then get the drop-down list select values asynchronously in the background, and once you have them, then flip it into a full drop-down list, okay? So you can just see the data immediately, and then when the form renders, and then by the time you go and actually hit the drop-down, all the results are there. Because actually getting that data, if you've got a drop-down list of, say, 200 items, that can take a measurable amount of time, and you don't want the form kind of to be sitting there waiting with nothing in it while while the user's interacting with it. So there's a little bit of optimization like that too. Now I have to pass a few things into this to have enough metadata available to render the HTML on the client. So what have I got? I've got the property on the model that I'm rendering it for. I've got the display property that I want to actually show as the selected value. So there's artist ID, which is what will be stored, right? Because it's the drop-down list. It's a foreign key. And then I've got the artist's name is what you'll actually show. Very similar so far to the existing drop-down list. I've got where is it coming from? Where are the items coming from? In this case, they're coming from viewModel.artists. That's in my client. Okay, so my client's going to have those choices already. What do you want to render when there's null? Okay, so what's the null option? That's choose artist. That's like -- select. You'll see a lot. And then I've got this horrible Razor way of having to pass HTML attributes in. This is one of the things that we're looking to fix in the next version of Razor. This problem of helpers today is that when you go to use a helper in Razor, you're back in C# land. So composing HTML in C# method arguments is horrible, right? There's no nice way of doing that. So today you have to pass in an anonymous object with a whole bunch of stuff. It means you lose all the HTML IntelliSense, all the HTML tooling goes away, the colorization is wrong. We're going to fix this, okay? We have ideas for Razor in the next version how we can make this nice. But today, here's my form control. That's a Bootstrap class. ng model, this is what you have to tell Angular. What am I data binding to in my model? That's viewModel.album.artistID. And then ng disabled says, if the expression that you pass to ng disabled is true, then Angular will mark the form, that field as disabled. You can't interact with it. So I'm saying if the entire view model is marked as disabled, or the number of artists in my artist lookup array is less than 2, that is, if I only have 1, which was that initial value I told you about, the one that actually maps to this record, if it's less than 1, then disable the drop-down box. I don't want you to be able to select one until I've actually loaded all the other ones. Okay? As soon as that flips to more than 1, or 2 or more, then you can select it. It means I can asynchronously load them in the background.
Is that where you use a filter to do a check on artist for null, maybe?
So the question was, would I use a filter to check for artists on null? You could. Filters are, you absolutely could, right? Because filters just take an input, do some processing, and return an output. Doesn't matter if they're Boolean or string. I tend to only use filters for things like formatting. So I have a title case filter, for instance, and a truncate filter, so that I can say, it doesn't matter how long the text is, just render it to this many and then put the ellipsis at the end. Okay? But different people use filters in different way. I know people who just don't use filters at all. They prefer that logic to always be in the view model so they can test it. Other people are happy to put things like truncate, because it's like in the view itself, because I mean, who wants to test the fact that it truncates? I mean, you could if you wanted to. That's a personal choice. Okay, so that's the source. What does it actually render as? So I did some Razor stuff in order to get rid of what. So let's reload this form. Now, because it's a proper SPA app, I can hit F5 and it still works, right? Because the URL is a hash URL, okay? Hash albums 82 edit. So when I refresh it, the server doesn't see everything past the hash, but Angular does. So it knows to load the right controller, passes that 82 through to the view model, that then goes to the server, gets the data, and renders the form, and everything just looks like it would in a non-SPA application. So let's look at the source. We were looking at the artist drop-down field, I believe. So we'll talk about this big chunk of stuff in a minute. And I have to obviously not do it that way. I have to do it this way because it's loaded on the fly. So let's zoom in here. So here's my select. Okay, so here's my col MD10. There's my label. This is what that helper output. It output my select. And you can see the classes there, ng pristine, ng valid, ng valid. These are all the directives that are required to do good forms in Angular. The helper just takes care of it for you. Has visited, has the ID, the name. Is it disabled? There's that expression we saw that will flip to true when it's disabled. Here's my model. Here's my options. Now, this is how you tell Angular to load a select list. It says, for artist ID as a name for a in viewModel.artist. Now, it's kind of verbose. It's kind of link-like. But you have to read the documentation to really know what that means. Essentially, it's an expression that tells Angular how to build the right shaped data set from something on your view model to build a drop-down list. Okay? It says, well, what do you need? You have an array of stuff. I need to turn that into name-value pair, essentially, to build the list. And I need to know what to set when you select one. Okay? That's what that expression says. Again, you didn't have to do any of that because the helper did it for you. So we kind of get that value by doing that. Now, the other thing it did was render validation. So if we go down here, it rendered this span for you. You didn't have to put a separate validation in. It just did it for you. Help block, blah, 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 blah. ng show. Don't show the validation message until it's actually invalid. Okay? That means if someone has tried to submit the form, edit album.submit attempted, or the artist ID property is dirty. So this is a built-in Angular thing. So Angular supports change tracking within form fields. It's really good at doing forms. So $dirty just means has someone tried to do it. Or someone has visited it. So you might have tabbed through that field, but not actually changed it. So it won't be dirty, but you would have visited it. Visited is a custom directive that I wrote. So out of the box, Angular doesn't have a concept of whether something's been visited. It just knows whether it's dirty or not. So I wrote a directive that will tell you whether any particular form field has been visited or not. It's a very common sort of boilerplate thing that people do. We've just included this out of the box here. So if someone tries to submit the form, they click the submit button, or they've edited this field, or they've visited the field by giving it focus, and there's currently a validation error against that field. So edit album is the form name. Artist ID is the field name. If there's an error, and the error is the fact that it's missing a value because it's required, then it will show the artist ID field is required. Okay? If you were going to do Angular raw in SPA, you would have to do all this by default, like yourself. And if you look at the documentation for Angular, that's what it teaches you how to write. It's extremely verbose. But you can see very clearly how it's composed. Okay? It's very flexible. It's all just JavaScript expressions. And it uses these properties which are populated by directives. Directives know how to look at the DOM. But because we used a helper, I was just able to do it in a very sort of familiar MVC style fashion. Okay? Okay, so that, yes, I don't want to reboot just now. That's an example of a custom helper. Now I've done them for drop-down list, I've done them for text box, and I've done them for validation message. That's pretty, and the validation class, very important to get that nice visibility of the whole thing. That's pretty much all I had to do. Those 4 helpers gave me the ability to do pretty much all the forms I needed to in Music Store. So not that much work. It's about 300 lines of code to do those helpers. The idea is in ASP.NET vNext, we would ship these helpers in the box. Okay? There would be a NuGet package that has Angular helpers for Razor. They would be there by default in the SPA template, and they'd be open source, and you can party on them, you can change them, do whatever you like. But if you're interested in these now, these work on MVC5. This application is MVC5. This is open source. It's one of the samples up in ASP.NET vNext. Go up and have a look at how I did it. OK, so that's form helpers using Angular. Razor helpers for Angular. What about client-side directives and patterns? OK, so I have some other stuff that I did. If we go back to the form, let's go to home. Let's look at the source for this page. OK. Let's have a look in here. Oh, that's not what I want. OK. So you'll note here I have a script tag which is ID user details. Type is application JSON, and inside of it is a JSON payload. Is the user authenticated? What is their username? What's their user ID? And what roles are they in, if any? One of the other things when doing SPAs, obviously, is that we have this problem of the data is on the server, and my application is now running in the client. So you've seen how we can use Razor to render in model metadata, which helps in generating templates for doing the stuff we saw. But what about other things like user details? Now, the login in this application still takes place on the server, because security really only exists on the server. The client is like the Wild West, right? You can't do anything secure in the client at all. So if I log off here and I hit login, that's a full page navigation. Okay? I still have return URL. Okay, so that still works. It's a whole bunch of URL encoded crap, but it does work. If I hit administrator and I go and get this super secure password, which is in the web.config file, you should change this password, and hit login, it takes me back to the home page, and now I'm logged in as administrator. That all happens server-side, but I've got a little bit of client-side magic in there as well. So let me go to my layout view. Actually, I think it's in home index. Let's have a look. Nope, layout. Nope, let's go back here. Must be in here, I'm just not seeing it. Nope. Let's find it. Oh, it's probably in. Login partial. That would make sense. OK. So in the login partial, now the login partial is the bit that renders these 2 links, essentially at the top. It does the normal stuff for doing login partial, but it also does this. I have an HTML.json. This is a new helper that I wrote that lets you inline JSON data islands in the HTML. Why would you do that? Well, it prevents it means that you don't have to go back and call the server to get data that you could have just rendered in line. Okay? So in this case, this partial deals with logging people in. So it always knows whether you're logged in or not, right? It seems like the logical place to put this data. I just render a data island that says, if the person is logged in, render a bunch of stuff that might be useful to the client. What roles are they in? What's their username, etc. And if they're not, if we go back to the is not, which is here, it just renders one that says, hey, no, you're not logged in and it's all false. So the data island is nice, but how do I get it in my Angular application? Well, that's where we have a service. So if I go back to my client code and look at the components, you can see over here I have a service called user details. If I open that up, this is a service that knows how to find that particular element in the page if it exists. And if it does, it returns an object that represents that data. So now I can take this service into controllers in my application, and I have the details of the user inside that controller. So now I can have a view that wants to make decisions about what it would show based on what roles you're in or what the username is or something like that. You just take this service into your controller, and now you can get it very, very simply. To that end, one of the other big problems with spas is the problem of initial load. When you hit the home page for the first time, you have to wait for a whole bunch of crap to be downloaded from the server. The JavaScript, all the templates. Then you have to, once you've got that, call back to the server to actually get the data to render the home page, right? It's one of the big problems that when we spoke to the Angular team about what we were doing, they said, you know, it'd be great if you could look at how you could help solve this initial load problem. Well, it turns out Angular has some built-in features to help alleviate that. And if we couple that again with Razor and helpers, we can get a fairly nice experience. So if I look at the network stack for this home page, I'm going to hit F5. This is everything that's been requested from the home page, okay? There's a whole bunch of normal browser stuff, like images and CSS. I'm not too concerned about that. We all know how to deal with those things. But let's have a look at the stuff that's particular to a spa. I'm going to filter down to Ajax Requests. And we can see we have a few things going on here. These two requests here are for templates, okay? ng-apps component genre menu, ng-apps music store.store home, genre menu HTML, and home.html. These are the templates that Angular is going to use to render the page. Now, you can actually inline these. Angular has built-in support for rendering a script tag that has this HTML in it already, and then you don't have to make the Ajax call back to the server. It'll just do that automatically. I just haven't got around to building a helper for that yet because it was kind of easy. I tackled the harder one first. Now, these two down here are to do with browser links. They're not my application. That's the browser link feature in VS, so I don't care about those. What you'll note is there are no requests for data. I have data on this page. I have the data that represents the menu, and I have the data that represents the most popular album. So how did they turn up? Well, if I look at the source of this page, you can see here I have a data island for app inline data for API/genre/menu. Here's a bunch of JSON. And then down here I have, scroll, app inline data for API albums most popular. And here's the data for my most popular albums. So what's going on here? Well, I wrote a Angular directive called the app inline data directive. Now, the reason it has app in the beginning is the best convention in Angular is that when you write a directive, you prefix it with something that's exclusive to your app. Everything in Angular is prefixed with ng unless it actually maps directly to an existing HTML field. Like there is a input directive and a form directive. Obviously, they just map directly to what they called in HTML. In this case, you're required to put this attribute on something for the directive to kick in. Okay? So it's app inline data. The for attribute is read by this directive, and this maps to what URL would the browser have made a request to get this data. Okay? So you can probably see where this is going. What I have now is pre-rendered results for API calls that the browser would have made had this data not been there. So how did I actually get that in my view? It was really easy. If I go to the home page, because that's where I care about this, views home index, I have a helper called inline data. All I had to do was give it the controller name and the method. It's very similar to the child action helper, okay? Except that instead of rendering HTML inline, it knows how to render JSON, okay? If I get rid of this, if I just comment this out, and comment this one out as well, and refresh the page, it still works. Now, why did it work? Well, because I wrote the client-side services to deal with the fact if it's not there. So now I have two extra Ajax requests. I have to get the data for my menu and the data for my albums, okay? And so when I wrote the services, the client-side services, the Angular services that get that data, they're over here. So let's look at genre menu. Here it is. Sorry, let's look at the album API. Here we go. So this one is, how do I get the most popular albums? How do I get the list of albums to put in the menu? Let's go down and find the method that gets the most popular albums. Get most popular albums, okay? It resolves the URL. So I've got a client-side URL resolver, which I won't talk about, but you can look at the source code as well, which means that you can kind of use server-side, the ASP.NET /app relative root, you can use that in the client as well, which is kind of nice. And then inline data is equal to this underscore inline data, unless that, if that is true, then go ahead and get the inline data for this URL, otherwise it's null. If inline data exists, then just return the data. Don't do any service call. Otherwise, if inline data doesn't exist, go ahead and use HTTP to call that URL, and then when that's finished, return the data from that result. Okay? So all it is basically a cache that gets populated by that directive, and then the services are written to first look in that cache. The cache itself is called inline data. So if I scroll up and see where that's actually defined, it's up here. Inline data is equal to cachefactory.get. This is an Angular primitive. Angular has a first-class support for client-side caching. You use this cache factory to create a new cache. I just have a global cache in my application called the inline data cache. And the keys for the items are the URLs. So if you're going to go out and call a URL, the first thing you do is look in the cache using that URL or the key. If there's data there, just use that directly. Now, obviously, you can make it more complicated. You could add timeouts and cache invalidation routines and all that type of stuff. But this was just a proof of concept to show what you could do with just a little bit of work to get rid of a big portion of those XHR requests that happen when you first load the home page and wrap it all up in a Razor helper so that when it comes back to your source code, again, all you had to do was add that. And you just decorate those in the views, like the server-side views, where you know that view is subsequently going to make Ajax calls. Okay? It's as simple as that. Okay, so I'm out of time. Very, very quickly, TypeScript and Grunt TSNG. So I've been using TypeScript, and you may note if you've done Angular before that this TypeScript looks nothing like what you would do in Angular. So I wrote a TypeScript preprocessor for Angular that is pulled in via Grunt. And what it basically lets you do is write your code, your Angular code, in TypeScript-centric fashion. You create interfaces and you create classes that implement those interfaces. I'm using the definitely typed package for Angular, so I have type information for the Angular library. So for things like, where's a good example of that? HTTP is a good example. So if I look at the album API surface, you can see I'm taking in cache factory. That comes from the ng module. Okay, so I have IntelliSense for stuff in Angular because there are type definitions for TypeScript for that stuff. The Grunt TSNG scans all the TypeScript in your application and then pre-compiles it into .ng.ts file. So let me go out to the file system, go into this source. I'm going to go to Client, ng apps. We'll go to Components, Album API, and you can see here, here's my source file, and here's the pre-processed file that I created that you'll actually ultimately compile. So let me look at that in Sublime, and this will look a little bit more like what you might be used to when you write Angular. Okay, so what I did, I added the TypeScript reference, and then down the bottom, here's all my source code, and then down the bottom, here's the code that you would usually write to tell Angular about this service. Okay, you would put it in a module called music stored to album API, you would call the service method, you would give it a name, and then you would pass in its dependencies, and then that's how you would register the service. I find that this is really error-prone, because these are all strings. And so you mistype something, and you spend 15 minutes trying to figure out why stuff in Angular doesn't load. So I just remove that problem. If you use TypeScript, the compiler will tell you when you misspell something, and then you just generate all of this stuff from your type information. Okay? So if that's interesting to you, you want to look at a Grunt TSNG, TypeScript NG. It's a node module. There it is there. And you plug that into your Grunt build step, and now you can compile your TypeScript into a pre-processed set of TypeScript, which you then compile into JavaScript, and you will never have to write Angular dot again in your application. You can get rid of that whole class of errors. That's something, again, that we're looking at perhaps supporting out of the box in the next version of the templates, if you choose TypeScript as a language. If you choose JavaScript, obviously, you won't use that. You'll have to do it yourself. OK, so in the future, what are we looking at doing? I didn't talk about Bauer, except that I told you what it was in the very beginning. So we're looking to support via a Bauer as a first-class citizen in Visual Studio. So just like today you have a NuGet experience, there'll be a Bauer experience. Similar for NPM is the Node package manager. Grunt, its plugins are brought in via NPM because Grunt itself runs on Node. So we're looking at a first-class NPM experience. In fact, it already exists in VS if you install the Node tools for Visual Studio, which is written by Microsoft. We're looking at integrating that experience into ASP.NET. First-class support for Grunt, so that you can get running Grunt, scraping the output of your Grunt tasks, and then getting those errors back into Visual Studio and like squiggling your JavaScript files and things like that. Debugging your Grunt files, getting IntelliSense in your Grunt files, those type of things. Again, Grunt's based on Node, so to get that to work, we need the Node tooling for Visual Studio to light up in ASP.NET applications, which is what we're looking at making work. Scaffolding of service proxies. So that API service I just showed you that was doing the looking at the cache first, I could have completely automatically generated that just from the web API. The shape of the data, the URL, the arguments, all that stuff was predefined in the server-side code. Why should I have to write all that TypeScript code manually? So we're looking at building scaffolding. You can just point at the API. It'll completely generate the Angular service for you as a base class. And then if you want to change stuff, you just derive from it in the client, and you just fiddle with the bits you want. Again, removes a whole bunch of code that you have to write while helping to keep stuff, quote-unquote, best practice in the client. Obviously, full IntelliSense for Angular in HTML and JavaScript. So today, all those data binding expressions, all the ng attributes, your custom attributes, there's no IntelliSense for any of that. We're looking at lighting that up with a full 100% IntelliSense experience inside HTML, hopefully even with things like navigation. So you can sort of go inside a data binding expression, hit F12, and it'll take you to the correct JavaScript or TypeScript file. And then obviously we'll have templates and snippets for all this stuff as well. That's it. So if you're interested in this in the future, I encourage you to look at this MV Store repo. This is where we're continuing to sort of evolve on this stuff. That's my Twitter handle. Feel free to ask me questions, and I have some time now to take questions from you now. So hand over here. Wait for the mic.
Usually brings the mic, yeah. While you were talking, I was trying to, I cloned the repo and ran the NVC Music Store SPA. And it looks really nice. When I tried to run it, it wasn't pulling any of the JavaScript files. So I'm wondering, do I need to install Bauer?
Yes.
Which I did.
Yes.
And
so great question. I can answer it already.
Okay.
So today there's no integration between like when you build your application and doing all the client-side stuff. So to get the clone to work, you have to first clone it, obviously. Then you'll have to go out to the command line, and I can show you this. So this is, I'm in the application now, right?
Yeah.
You'll have to do an npm install, which will install the node modules that this application needs, okay? I've already got them installed, so it didn't do much. Then you'll have to do a Bauer install after you've installed Bauer. So that's npm install -g Bauer, which installs Bauer globally. That installs the Bauer components, which again I already have. And then once you've done those two things, you'll have to run Grunt. Grunt will do that client-side build, and you can see it's doing all the stuff here. So it's converting my less to CSS, it's compiling my TypeScript into JavaScript, it's copying all those files from the client folder over to the folder that they actually get served from for the website. And then once that's finished, then you'll be able to run the application. So one of the things that we'll do in vNext is obviously look at how to make this process first class as well. When you open the project in the next version of Visual Studio, what I'd love to happen is the Bauer packages would install in the background for you by default. The npm modules would install in the background for you by default. And when you hit build, the Grunt task would run. So you wouldn't have to worry about doing all this stuff manually. Today, you have to kind of do this client-side stuff separately from the command line.
So for now, it sounds like I need to install Node and npm,
Yes.
and then Bauer, and then I go to the directory for the SPA.
Yep.
And then I run npm install Bauer install and then Grunt, and it's
Got
done.
it.
Okay.
That's it.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
Other
Yes.
questions?
Thanks, Damon. That's super cool. Where do you write your tests?
Great question. Where do you write the tests? If I had written tests, I wrote them in my head. That's totally up to you, right? So you can absolutely either write tests in a separate project and then set up you could set up Grunt to copy source files from the source project into the test project when you run your tests, or you can just keep them in the same project. So I could have in this folder, in this project had a folder called tests, or I could stick it under client, wherever I want to put them. And then generally, you would have a Grunt task configured. So if I go into my Grunt file, Okay, so this is all the Grunt plugins I'm using. And then this is the configuration for all of my Grunt stuff. There's a fair bit because I'm doing a bunch of stuff, right? I would have a test runner configured in here. So if I'm using Jasmine or QUnit or the Angular one, a protractor, or any of those types, whatever it is I'm using for doing tests, I would use the Grunt plugin that is the test runner for that. And then I would have a Grunt task for running those tests. And I would go to the command line, type Grunt test, and it would run my tests. That's kind of a personal choice.
So I guess the other part of that question is, in your experience of doing these kind of applications, this is very cutting edge and different stuff. What are you testing?
So from what I've seen, most people, Angular is one of the things that Angular is really built around is testing. That's why DI is really first class. And they have an Angular mocking lib module that comes with Angular so that you can mock the stuff that's in Angular as a first class thing. You would test your controllers and you test your services. And for things like services that call the server, you would just mock out the HTTP layer because that's built into Angular. And then you would test the fact that when you call this method on your service, it actually calls the right thing with the right URL and returns the right data and that type of stuff. It's very similar to what you would test on the server in an MVC application. You would test pretty much everything except the view. And you might test the view using functional end-to-end testing with browser automation and stuff like that. Yeah, with Selenium or WebDriver or something like that. Yep.
I'm over here.
One over there? Yeah.
That inline data, it kind of preempted the API calls and put it on the page.
Yes.
Could you write something that if that action for some reason was taking a long time, could you just choose to ignore it and then get the browser to request it upon render to make the initial page load quicker?
So you mean if that rephrase the question, so I'm not quite following.
Okay,
what you mean.
so that top inline data call that genres API, if for some reason that call started
on the server side, it's taking a while.
Yeah.
I see. That's hard today because asynchronous child actions aren't supported in Razor today, and so it's kind of difficult to time it out because the method, this inline data method, has to be synchronous because when Razor executes it, it doesn't support asynchrony. Next version of Razor supports async, so things like that would be possible because you could just use the task composition APIs to say, call this asynchronous method, but if it takes more than 300 milliseconds, just bail out and do this other thing instead, right? It's a little hard to do in synchronous code, aka impossible to do in synchronous code, because you're waiting for the thing to end. If it doesn't end, there's nothing you can do. It'll just keep going until it ends. It's on the stack, right? You could try and do some tricks with starting a thread, calling it, and then synchronizing it, but I would thoroughly recommend you don't do that because you'll just end up shooting yourself in the face, all right? So the quick answer is no, you can't today, but in the next version, things like that would be possible because we have async support in Razor.
More questions?
Maybe, yeah.
Question about Kendo UI. Have you used it with Angular, and if so, how well does it integrate?
So the question is Kendo UI. Love Kendo UI. I haven't used it in Angular because I don't write apps for a living anymore. But this one is kind of the only app I've written in the past year. They have first-class Angular support. They had an Angular Directives pack that was in sort of labs for a while, and I believe it went RTM about 6 weeks ago, if anyone else knows the answer to this. So if you go up to Kendo UI Angular Directives in your favorite search engine, Kendo Labs, github.io, Angular Kendo. But if we go back to, that's June last year, they actually announced that it was now first class and supported. So it's pretty cool. Like it basically has first class directives for all of the widgets in Angular, in Kendo. And they're not the only ones that have done this. So the other ones that did this were Widgmo. They now have Angular directives as well for all of their widgets. And I'm using in my application the Bootstrap UI, or was it? UI Bootstrap, which is a set of Angular directives to help you use Bootstrap in Angular applications. And the one that I really like is that pager I showed you. So to give you an example of what that looks like, if I go into client, go into NG apps, I go into the server, admin, and I go to the album list here. So this is my grid view, right? Poor man's grid view. Manually rendered, it's just a table. There's all the little glyphs, the sorting glyphs. Down here. So that's an example of what a third-party client-side control, looks like when you wrap it up in an Angular directive. There's no more JavaScript anymore to bootstrap the thing. It just looks like a native HTML element. This is really the power of Angular and web components. So it's pagination, and then you have custom attributes to sort of hook it up to your view model and to define behavior like what method do you call on the view model when someone chooses a page. So for instance, on select page, it calls load page and passes in the current page. Once I had the grid view running, I need to add pagination. This element in UI Bootstrap, I added pagination in like 5 minutes. And typically pagination, I already had the API set up for pagination. It's kind of a well understood pattern. I have a page list structure, which has been around since the beginning of MVC. So the API was set up to take page number and the number of rows that you want on each page and stuff. This thing just mapped to that one-to-one. It was just beautiful. And so Widmo Kendo UI have these type of directives. So it works well, but I haven't actually used it myself.
Hey, how do people deal with SEO in SPAs nowadays?
Great question. Next. Oh.
That's a great answer.
So no, in all seriousness, SEO, it's actually a lot more advanced and developed, I should say, than I realized. There are predominantly 3 patterns for doing this. It requires some thought, obviously, because search engines still aren't running your page as a browser today. They basically request the HTML. They do download JavaScript and other things now, but they're still not running it. So what people do is they think very carefully about what parts of their application they want to be crawlable by a search engine. Okay? And for those parts, they have a no script tag in the home page, so that if you hit the home page of your application, everything inside no script will still be looked at by the search engine and considered as something that can be crawled. So you put all the links that you want crawlable inside there. From that point on, you can do a number of things. One, you know about the hash bang support in search engines. Anyone heard of this? So you'll see when I click on to look at Amy Whitehouse's album here, the URL is my site hash albums 5. This part never goes to the server, okay? And so it's no good Google sending me this URL because servers don't understand this. This is known as a fragment at the end here, and they never get sent to servers. So what you need to do is if you have a hash bang, and there's a 1 line of config in Angular to change all these URLs to be hash bang instead of hash, when Google sees a hash bang link in HTML, because remember, it still crawls the HTML and sees the hash bang or the hash link there, what it will do is it will turn that URL into one that the server can understand. It basically changes it into your website, question mark, it's some query string thing like it's hash token, blah, 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 equals, and then it passes in this part after it. Now, your server will get that. And then what you have to do is have something on the end of the server that understands that type of request and go, oh, this is the search engine calling me back to figure out what the hell should happen when the client goes to this URL from their browser. And at that point, you can do a number of things, right? Because you can't just render it because you don't have server-side rendering like you do. So people do a number of things. They either pre-generate all of that HTML using something like Grunt, and there are a bunch of tasks available to you that will fire up a headless browser like Phantom.js, and based on your configuration, will crawl the site like a search engine and pre-generate all that HTML for you into a bunch of files that you can then just serve from a standard controller when your Google ultimately calls you back. Or you can do it on the fly. So your application, when it gets that URL from Google, when Google calls you back with the question mark, blah, 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 you can go, oh, this is Google. Let me fire up a headless browser, Phantom.js, like inline on the server, send it that URL, you turn it back into the browser URL, render it, and then send the HTML, cache it so it doesn't do it again. You can do that. Or you can pay a third party so that when you get that call from Google, rather than you firing up Phantom.js and doing it, you just proxy that request straight through to the third party with your API key and let them render it for you and then have them return the result back through you. And there are paid services that do this already. Now, there are some really good blog posts on how to do this already and what grunt tasks or no tasks you want to set up to do this pre-generation. Also, NG Book, which is by far the best Angular book I've come across. It's enormous. It's about 500 pages. But the first 100 pages are the best introduction to Angular I've seen. It has an entire chapter on doing SEO, which talks about all of these patterns for doing it. I've read anecdotal stuff that says, I never really thought about SEO before, so when I was forced to think about it and do it in spars, I ended up with much better SEO results, even though it was a little bit harder. And once I got it set up, it was easy. Like once I got through the initial hump of getting the system set up, it was always a first-class thing. It's like, okay, I'm adding a new view. How do I want that to appear to a search engine? Because now it's a thought. You have to stick the URL in if you really wanted to do it. And they ended up with much better results as a result of doing that. So it is possible, but it requires setup.
Apparently, Google knows how to run JavaScript.
Yeah, so very recently, I think Google has started downloading JavaScript. My understanding is they still don't render it like a browser. And so they do?
They acknowledge that they do.
They do now.
They've been able to do that for 3 years, but they acknowledge that they're doing that now.
OK, awesome. So they're actually doing it now. Well, perfect. So just disregard everything I said.
Google is doing it, but it's not the only search engine.
It's not.
Just kidding.
Touche, sir. Touche.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so it's well documented, though. Have a look at it.
Any other questions? All right, thank you. Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.